The Canadian shopping mall is essentially a graveyard for retail empires that thought they were too big to ever die. Hudson's Bay is arguably the most jaw-dropping example of this collapse. The legendary department store, Canada's oldest company, a business older than the country itself, vanished from every single mall in 2025 after 355 years of trading. And it dragged a beloved discount chain called Zellers down with it not once, but twice. Back in 1978, Hudson's Bay executives watched a discount revolution sweeping across North America and made an aggressive, defensive bet. They bought Zellers with the absolute conviction that they were acquiring the ultimate weapon against the coming wave of American big box stores. The boardroom plan was to own both ends of the Canadian market at once, the fancy department store and the cheap and cheerful discounter, locking shoppers in no matter how much money they had. Fast forward to today, and that ambitious dream has morphed into one of the most spectacular corporate failures in the history of North American retail. The grand vision of total market domination collided head-on with a blue and red American juggernaut named Walmart. Instead of building an untouchable retail dynasty, this gamble eventually helped sink a company that had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and 3.5 centuries of upheaval. This is the story of how Hudson's Bay absorbed Zellers to rule Canadian retail, accidentally sold it to the worst possible buyer, and then collapsed so completely that the only thing left of either brand is a single store and a museum charter. Stick around, because the way this empire actually died is far stranger than anyone expected. Long before Hudson's Bay ever owned a discount store, it had already spent 3 centuries rewiring how an entire continent did business. The company was founded in 1670 under a royal charter granted by King Charles II, which handed it control over a staggering chunk of North America for the purpose of trading fur. We are talking about a company so old it effectively functioned as a government, running trading posts across the wilderness long before Canada was even a nation. Over the centuries, those remote fur trading forts slowly evolved into actual stores, and those stores eventually became grand department store palaces anchoring the downtown core of every major Canadian city. By the 20th century, Hudson's Bay was a genuine cultural institution. Generations of Canadians bought their winter coats, their wedding china, and their Christmas gifts under that famous striped blanket logo. It was the place you went for the things that mattered. But running a premium department store is an expensive, slow-moving game, and by the 1970s the leadership could see a cheaper, faster kind of retail rising up that threatened to steal their customers entirely. To understand the panic that led them to Zellers, you first need to understand just how powerful that little discounter had quietly become. Zellers started as a scrappy underdog with a genuinely brutal origin story. Walter P. Zeller, a former Woolworth delivery boy, opened his first stores in Ontario in 1928, only to get bought out almost immediately by an American chain that promptly went bankrupt in the Great Depression. Instead of walking away, Zeller bought back the failed Canadian locations and relaunched the company in 1931 as stores for thrifty Canadians. That single phrase became the entire personality of the brand. Zellers wasn't fancy and never pretended to be. It was where ordinary families went to stretch a paycheck, and the company leaned into that identity with a marketing slogan that would echo across Canadian television for decades, where the lowest price is the law. They built an entire culture around value. They launched the Club Z loyalty program, letting shoppers collect points on every purchase and redeem them for rewards, which hooked millions of households into coming back again and again. They even had a beloved teddy bear mascot named Zeddy, who became a fixture of Canadian childhood. By the late 1990s, Zellers had exploded into roughly 350 locations spread coast to coast, making it one of the most recognized retail names in the country. So when Hudson's Bay went looking for a way to defend itself against cheap competition, it didn't build a discounter from scratch. It simply bought the best one going, snapping up Zellers in 1978. For a while, it genuinely looked like the smartest move the old fur trading giant had ever made. But a single American competitor was about to cross the border and turn that triumph into a slow-motion disaster. The moment that quietly doomed the entire empire arrived in 1994, when Walmart marched into Canada by buying out the struggling Woolco chain. On paper, Zellers should have been perfectly positioned to crush this invader. It had the stores, the brand loyalty, the Club Z points, and a slogan literally built around having the cheapest prices in the country. It was the established homegrown champion, exactly the kind of trusted domestic alternative shoppers claim they want when a giant foreign rival shows up. But Walmart didn't play by the old rules. The American chain operated at a scale and efficiency that Zellers simply could not match, squeezing suppliers harder, running leaner logistics, and pricing items so aggressively that Zellers eventually had to abandon its famous lowest price is the law promise altogether, because it could no longer actually keep that promise. This is the part that should make you wince. The slogan that defined the brand for half a century became a liability the second a competitor could genuinely beat it on price. Zellers stores started to feel dated and tired next to Walmart's bright, sprawling supercenters. Foot traffic drained away. The discounter that Hudson's Bay had bought as a defensive shield was now bleeding cash, and the parent company was running out of ideas for how to stop it. Which is exactly when an even bigger American retailer showed up waving an absolutely enormous check. By 2011, Hudson's Bay was desperate to stop the bleeding, and a perfect escape hatch appeared in the form of Target Corporation. The American chain wanted to enter the Canadian market fast, and rather than build hundreds of stores from the ground up, it wanted to inherit Zellers' prime real estate locations across the country. So Hudson's Bay struck what looked, at the time, like the deal of the century. It sold the lease agreements for up to 220 Zellers stores to Target for a staggering $1.825 billion. Think about that for a moment. A struggling, money-losing discount chain that couldn't beat Walmart suddenly transformed into nearly $2 billion of pure cash for its parent company. The Hudson's Bay leadership had managed to offload its biggest problem at an almost unbelievable price. Most of the Zellers locations were converted into Target Canada stores, while the brand itself was effectively wound down, with the last remaining Zellers shops closing by March 2013 after more than 80 years of trading. For Hudson's Bay, it genuinely seemed like a masterstroke. They had taken a dying asset and converted it into a war chest. But the universe has a dark sense of humor about deals that look too good to be true, because the buyer who handed over all that money was about to detonate in the most catastrophic way imaginable. What happened to Target Canada next remains one of the most legendary failures in retail history, and it matters enormously for our story. Target rushed its Canadian launch, opening well over 100 stores in a frantic burst, and almost immediately drowned in operational chaos. Its supply chain was a disaster, leaving shelves visibly empty while back rooms overflowed with stock the system couldn't track properly. Prices were often higher than American shoppers expected from the brand, alienating the exact value-conscious customers Zellers had once served. The whole expansion was so badly botched that Target Canada burned through billions of dollars and threw in the towel in 2015, abandoning the entire country barely 2 years after arriving. The brutal irony here is almost too perfect. Hudson's Bay had sold Zellers to a company that not only failed to replace it, but failed so spectacularly that it left a giant smoking crater of empty big box stores across Canada. The discount retail space Zellers once dominated was now a vacuum, with Walmart and the growing power of online shopping rushing in to fill it. Hudson's Bay walked away with its $1.825 billion, but the broader Canadian retail landscape it depended on was being permanently reshaped by forces it could no longer control. And while all of this discount drama was unfolding, the mothership itself, the grand old department store, was quietly being loaded up with a kind of debt that would eventually prove fatal. While everyone was watching the Zellers saga, the real danger was building inside Hudson's Bay's own ownership structure. Over the years, the company had passed through the hands of American private equity, eventually falling under the control of a real estate dealmaker named Richard Baker. And this is where the strategy shifted in a way that would haunt the entire business. Baker and his backers were fundamentally fascinated by one thing above all else: the immense value of the real estate that Hudson's Bay sat on. Those grand downtown flagship stores occupied some of the most valuable land in the country, and the company increasingly behaved less like a retailer and more like a property empire that happened to sell sweaters. Massive mortgages were taken out against the buildings, secured against flagship locations in cities like Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto. The actual job of selling clothes and housewares started to feel like an afterthought compared to the underlying value of the bricks and mortar. Then, in November 2024, the company made a fateful move, spinning off its more valuable American assets, including the luxury Saks brand, into a separate entity called Saks Global. That spin-off effectively stripped away some of the strongest pieces of the empire, leaving the Canadian Hudson's Bay business increasingly exposed and increasingly fragile. The stage was now perfectly set for a collapse, and all it would take was one bad year to bring the whole 355-year-old structure crashing down. The end, when it finally came, arrived with shocking speed. On March 7, 2025, Hudson's Bay filed for creditor protection with the Ontario Superior Court, the Canadian equivalent of declaring it could no longer pay its bills. The company blamed a brutal cocktail of weak consumer spending, the relentless rise of online shopping, and a post-pandemic retail environment that had hollowed out the traditional department store model. Within weeks, the situation went from troubled to terminal. On March 24, the company began liquidating all but 6 of its stores, and by late April, even those final survivors were thrown onto the liquidation pile. By June 2025, every single Hudson's Bay department store in the country had permanently shut its doors, ending 3.5 centuries of continuous trading in a matter of months. Let that sink in. A company that predates Canada itself, that survived world wars and depressions, was wiped off the map in a single brutal spring. And the wind down got genuinely surreal. The company's assets were so historic that the court had to oversee the potential auction of around 400 pieces of art and artifacts, along with the original royal charter from 1670 itself. The Weston family's holding company eventually stepped in, offering $12.5 million to buy that founding charter and donate it to a museum, so that a literal piece of Canadian history wouldn't simply be sold off to the highest bidder. But the strangest twist of all was still waiting in the wreckage, because the brand names didn't just disappear. They got carved up and scattered. Here's where the story comes full circle in the most unexpected way. As the corpse of Hudson's Bay was picked apart, Canadian Tire stepped in and purchased the company's intellectual property, including the iconic striped logo and, remarkably, the old Zellers slogan. The lowest price is the law. But the Zellers name and trademarks themselves went somewhere else entirely. In August 2025, they were transferred to a company called Les Isles de la Mode, run by a Quebec fashion entrepreneur named Isaac Benida, who had already been experimenting with reviving the nostalgic brand. Hudson's Bay had actually tried to resurrect Zellers itself just a couple of years earlier, relaunching it in 2023 as a small store within a store concept tucked inside Bay locations. Banking heavily on pure nostalgia from Canadians who grew up with Zeddy and Club Z. That revival barely had time to find its feet before the parent company collapsed and took it down a second time. Meanwhile, the physical Hudson's Bay locations became their own battleground, with a British Columbia mall owner named Ruby Liu acquiring more than 24 store leases to launch an entirely new department store concept on the bones of the old one. So today, the brand that once meant thrifty Canadians clings to life as essentially a single store in Alberta under brand new ownership, while the 355-year-old giant that bought it has been reduced to a charter in a museum and a slogan owned by a tire company. Ultimately, the story of Hudson's Bay and Zellers serves as a brutal lesson in how even the oldest, most beloved companies on earth are not immune to the basic math of retail. Buying a discounter to defend your empire sounds brilliant in a boardroom, but it means nothing the moment a competitor arrives who is simply willing to operate cheaper and leaner than you ever could. Selling that discounter for nearly $2 billion looks like genius, right up until the buyer collapses and leaves your entire market gutted. And treating a historic retailer as a pile of valuable real estate works perfectly, until the day the shoppers stop coming and the debt comes due. A company can survive for 355 years, outlasting wars and empires and entire economic systems, and still be wiped out in a single spring once it loses sight of the one thing that actually kept it alive, people genuinely wanting to shop there. The brand that helped build a nation has been reduced to a museum exhibit and a nostalgic memory. But what do you reckon? Was Hudson's Bay doomed the moment Walmart crossed the border, or did decades of bad ownership and real estate gambling kill a company that could have survived? Should anyone even bother trying to revive Zellers, or is it kinda to just let the brand rest in peace? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below, and we genuinely want to hear it. What's your absolute best memory of wandering through a Zellers as a kid, or hunting for Club Z points, or grabbing a hot dog at the in-store diner? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the spectacular collapse of Canada's oldest company, give us a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell so you don't miss the next one. Cheers for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.